Hello, we're going to be talking about the Nervous System Project, which is a project being conducted at my grandson's school. This is Austin Martin. I am Professor Ephraim Media from New York University, and I study the brain. And as I said before, I am Austin's grandfather. A lot of people think that the brain is like a computer composed of wires where you enter information in it, like the brain takes in information. However, a computer is a machine and it never forgets. I mean, you can close this computer and then you can open it and things are exactly the same because it is a machine. Our brains, on the other hand, are more like plants, more like the leaves that sometimes grow. You have little ones, you have big ones, sometimes they get damaged and they repair themselves. You can see here I tear a leaf off, but it's still fine. So the plant changes from light to dark. It changes from winter to summer. It's a living organism that needs to be taken care of. That's what our brains are like. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the brain, the human brain. And as you can see, the human brain really has three main parts. One part is the cerebellum, which is involved in making us move smoothly. The other two main parts of the brain are called the brain stem, which includes the spinal cord and the main part of the brain stem, which holds the cerebral cortex. Okay, so these two parts of the brain take us to the cerebral cortex where all our memories are stored. Now, Austin, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so here we see a picture of the human brain. And notice that in this picture of the human brain, you have lots of blood that carries the energy into the brain because the brain uses a lot of energy when it works. Okay, and then down here you can see the cerebellum, the brain stem, which is connected to the spinal cord, is hidden in this picture. Next slide, Austin, please. In this slide, what I'm showing is that the brain is really composed of little cells which first began in plants, well, animal plants, which we call hydra, and these brain cells started becoming more and more sophisticated, more organized as you move from the hydra through the worm all the way up to a fly, where you have a central brain here. So the fly has a very evolved nervous system. Next slide. Here you can see that we're going to compare the size of a brain in a rat to that in a rabbit, to that in a cat, to that in a sheep, to that in a chimpanzee, a monkey. Then up here, you get up to the human brain, the dolphin brain. Notice the dolphin brain is actually bigger than the human brain, and the biggest brain of all is found inside the whale. So all animals have brains. Next slide. Here you can see what these brains actually do. And you can see that the front part of the brain is actually where a lot of the thinking is. You know, what are we going to do tomorrow? What am I going to do when I finish going to grammar school? What am I going to do when I get home? When you plan things out, you use this front part of your brain. The other part, the very back part of your brain, you use when you see things. This is called the visual part of the brain. And most of the brain is actually associated with doing things like hearing or speech or smell, taste. All these other different kinds of functions are found inside the brain. Someone who does, let's say, a lot of tasting, let's say they're a chef, will have a larger taste area than someone who, let's say, is a football player who doesn't do much tasting. They may have a bigger motor area and a smaller taste areas. So although these brain regions of the brain tell you specific functions, those functions change. Next slide. Oh, Austin, please. Here you can see that when you look at the brain has two sides. It has a right side and it has a left side. So you have two different brains. One part of your brain is really used more for numbers and language and being serious, and the other part of your brain has to do with being musical, for your emotions, things that are more sensitive. So you have a serious part of your right brain and an emotional, musical part of the left brain. And in people, these two sides are connected. So we feel sometimes serious and sometimes we feel musical, and those two parts of the brain are connected through something called the corpus callosum. Next slide, Austin. Here you can see what makes up the brain. And the main thing that when we talk about the brain, we're actually talking about brain cells, neurons. Now, neurons are not the only cell in the brain. There's blood cells that we talked about. There's cells that make energy. There's cells that make myelin. There's just many, many different kinds of cells that make the brain work. But the neuron has a cell body where the DNA is in the nucleus. It has dendrites that stick out from the cell body, which receives connections from other cells. And then it has a very long axon, and that axon ends in a part of the neuron that we call a synapse. The axon can be so long that it can go from the top of your head all the way down to the bottom of your spinal cord, a distance very, very long. And it can take, to send things from the top down to the bottom, it can take many, many days to get there, which is one of the reasons why we need sleep. Next slide, Austin. Here you can see the cell again, but this is more what it looks like. You see the cell body, you see all the dendrites around it, and you see that long, long axon that leaves from the cell. Over here you see a part of the brain that's involved in thinking. And as you can see there, it's the same thing. You see the individual neurons, they have the dendrites, and they have connections from their axons. So these cells line up and they all begin to work together like people in a city. And this last picture here shows what happens when the axon comes next to the dendrite. And you get that very special place called a synapse. And that's where these two neurons talk to each other in order to make something like this work. Next slide, Austin, please. Okay, so here what we're going to see is that we talked before about brains like in animals like rats. And you're going to see that when you look at those cells in the brain, they're small and they get more and more complex, so that the most complex cells are cells inside the human brain. So you can see the neurons in a small animal and the neurons in a large human brain, that the neurons, the dendrites become more and more complex and the whole neuron becomes bigger. This same change occurs when we grow up. When we're a little tiny baby, our neurons are smaller, and then as we get older and older and older, our neurons become more involved and more complex, so that the amount of information they contain gets bigger and bigger the older you are. Next slide. Here you can see that when we started talking earlier about the brain is not a computer, people for a long time thought that these neurons in the brain never changed And here you can see a very recent study that was done at New York University where they got an animal and they made a little hole on the top of its head so that they could look inside and actually see brain cells. And when they looked at those brain cells, they looked at the area where the synapses were. And what they found was that over time, some of those synapses went away and some of them were formed, so that your brain is constantly learning things and forgetting things by actually changing. Okay, and then I think that's the last slide. So what we need to know is that the brain has space for lots of information like reading and speaking and motor areas and taste areas, but that those areas actually change. It's something that we are now calling, and doing a lot of work on this, because it's called plasticity. And what that means is that the brain actually changes when you learn things and when you forget things. Forgetting is actually something that is normal because we are like plants, constantly changing, constantly growing, but we need a lot of attention. And Austin is going to tell us what happens when we do bad things to our brain. What happens? Here he's going to drink some poison, which is bad for the brain. And he falls down, and he's actually, I think, going to change into a Halloween skeleton. Oh dear. Okay, happy Halloween, everybody. Thank you.